Hi everyone. In the Legends of King Arthur, specifically in the Historia Regum Britanniae by Geoffrey of Monmouth, the famous Saint David of Wales is said to be the uncle of King Arthur. Now that's very interesting because there are no medieval genealogical records, not even clearly fictional ones, which make David an uncle of Arthur. The closest that there is a genealogical record which makes Arthur a great uncle of David, but obviously that's completely different to what Geoffrey of Monmouth said. So as someone who believes that King Arthur can be identified with the historical Athrwys, son of Meurig, I have been quite interested in seeing if I could find any evidence that David really was the uncle of Athrwys, because I think that would go a long way to contributing to supporting this theory that Athrwys was the historical King Arthur. And I believe I have discovered such evidence. So, first of all, let's look at David's parentage. So, in the life of Saint David and other genealogical records which give his genealogy, David is said to be the son of a person called Sant, or Sanctus, and his mother is someone called Non. Now, a lot of scholars see that these are very obviously fictional or symbolic names, Saint and Nun. The odds of one parent having such an overtly religious name is, it's unlikely, but it's possible. But the idea that this particularly famous religious saint had two parents with overtly religious names, Saint and Nun, I think that's obviously fictional, or symbolic if you prefer. And that is the opinion of many scholars. So with that being the case, there's no objection to making him the son of someone who didn't have the name Saint. If Saint was just Sanctus was just a symbolic name given to his father could have been named anything else. And the same goes with his mother. Another issue is that his genealogy goes back to Cynedda Wledig, but the problem is that Cynedda was born in about 370, and yet David is made the great-grandson of Cynedda, and yet David must have been born around about the year 500. And we know that because his death is quite reliably placed near the end of the 6th century. So he can't realistically have been born before or much before the year 500. So, with that being the case, if he was born around the year 500, would his great-grandfather really have been born so far back, as far as 370? That seems very unlikely. The length of each generation would have to be very long for that whole sequence. Now, there is another version of his genealogy which inserts another generation, which makes it better, but it would still have to mean that each generation was very long. Whereas an average of about 25 years or even less is much more reasonable. And yet, with the genealogy that we have for David, it doesn't accommodate that. Each generation would have to be much longer. So for that reason, I think that this genealogy that we see in the available records for David has been abbreviated, as well as the fact that his parents are given symbolic names. So the actual genealogy that we have for David it doesn't really help us to identify who he was in relation to other people. It may be that his father or his grandfather have been completely removed from the record. It may be that Sant is a symbolic name given to his father, or it may be that was actually a symbolic name given to someone earlier in his genealogy, and some more recent generations have been removed. It's difficult to say. Now, what's interesting is that the name David in medieval Wales was extremely rare. In fact, looking at Peter Bartram's Welsh Classical Dictionary, it seems that the famous David was the only person with that name. However, in addition to that, he's also recorded with the form Dewey, as in D-E-W-I. Now that's an even more unusual name, and in fact it's a name that's so unusual it requires explanation. And one of the explanations, well, this seems to be the standard explanation, and it's very plausible, is that this is the form of the name that was common in southwest Wales, because apparently in the dialect of Welsh in that area, it was common for a final double D to be dropped. So that takes off the D off the end of David's name, so that becomes Dewey, and the V becomes a W. So that's how he gets his name Dewey, but it's a very unusual name. I mean, David itself seems to have been an extremely uncommon name in medieval Wales, and Dewey, that specific form of the name David, was even less common. So it seems that he may well have been the only person in the available records as we have them who had that exact name. And yet, we find someone with that exact name, not just David, but Dewey, in the Book of Llandaff. Now this is very interesting, because you see in the life of St. David, it shows that he was active in much of South Wales, including the part of South Wales that the Book of Llandaff covers. He was even active specifically in Regum, which again is where the Book of Llandaff covers, and in fact that's the specific place where we find in the Book of Llandaff one of the witnesses was this Dewey. Now think about that. David was an extremely rare name, Dewey even more so, and yet we find someone with that exact name in exactly the same area that the famous St. David was active, at exactly the same time that he was active. Now what are the odds of two different people with that extremely rare name being active in the same area at the same time? And yet, if that's not the famous St. David, then that means that the famous St. David doesn't appear anywhere in the Book of Llandaff, even though many of the other major religious figures do appear, like Dubricius and Tylo and Caddoc and others. And yet David doesn't appear unless he's this Dewey, which seems like the most likely explanation. So with that being the case, I believe that this Dewey, who appears in the Book of Llandaff, was the famous Saint David. Now with that being the case, it's very interesting indeed that this Dewey is actually mentioned as being the son of a person called Kiran. Now I looked through all of the relevant entries of a Welsh classical dictionary, and as far as I could find, this name doesn't really exist. There's no one else recorded as having had that name, and even that beginning element, C-I-R, this Ker, it seems to be extremely rare. In fact, there's only one person who's recorded as having that element at the beginning of their name, but even then it's just a variant of another spelling, which is C-U-R. And regarding having a Y instead of an I, there are a few examples of that, but again, it's extremely rare. And like I said, this whole name, Kiran, doesn't seem to exist as the name of anyone else. So I think it's a very plausible suggestion, very legitimate, defendable suggestion, that this is not a legitimate name in its own right. It's a corruption of another name. So, what name? Well, as it happens, the maternal grandfather of Athrwys was called Gurgan. Now, in the Book of Llandaff, his name appears as Gurcant. Sometimes the T is dropped. So that would be Gurcan. Almost the same as the Kiran, who appears as the father of this Dewey in the Book of Llandaff. Now, to be clear, I don't like proposing unattested corruptions. So I don't like saying, well, I think this is a corruption of that, without being able to provide other examples of where this has demonstrably happened. Because if it hasn't demonstrably happened, then, well, obviously that's not necessarily a very strong case. So in the case of the beginning element C-I-R being a corruption of G-U-R, can I back that up? Well, I believe I can. So there are a few relevant examples. Well, first of all, I'll just mention that G and C were letters which were quite often exchanged for each other. There are plenty of examples of names that begin with G being changed into a C in other manuscripts, and vice versa. This isn't uncommon, and I'll present a few examples in the description. But one example is the case of Gurin. Now Gurin, that's Gurin, he appears in one record as Corono. So the Gur, the Gur, same beginning as in Gurgen, that's been changed into a Cor, Cor. So that's not the same as Cur with Cir, but it does show the change into a C and the U changing into a different vowel. Another example, which is perhaps more relevant, is someone who also had the name Gurin, spelt Gwrin. Now he appears in another manuscript as Kinner, which is very different, but it's Kynyr. So what's evidently happened there is that, part of what's happened is the N and the R have either been swapped or they've independently been corrupted into each other. The N has been corrupted into an R and the R has been corrupted into an N. But in either case, the key point here is that the beginning bit, the GU or GW, has been corrupted into a KY. And in other spellings of that name, Kinner, it's CY. So the point is that just like how, according to my proposal, that Kirken is a corruption of Gherkin, the first two letters, in that case it would be GU, they would need to be corrupted into a CI. That's exactly what we see here in this corruption from Gurin into Kinner. First two letters, GW, have been corrupted into a KY. So that demonstrates that this was a possible corruption. This is something that happened. Another example is from a character called Girthmore. I might not be pronouncing that right. In fact, I'm probably pronouncing all these names wrong, but hopefully you get the point anyway. But Girthmore, he appears as someone in association with King Arthur in the Welsh Triads. Now, his name in one record appears as GWER, as the beginning part, yet in another record, his name appears as GYR. So we see the GWER, which is another version of the GWR, and we see this, for example, in the name of Vortimer and Vortigern. So the GWER has been replaced with a GYR. And when we combine that with the other well-attested corruption of the change between the G and the C, that would be CYR. So we've got the GR, or GWR, being corrupted into a K or Kir, K or C, Y or I, R. So this proposal that I'm making, that Gherkin became corrupted into Kirken, that is supported by attested corruptions. There's nothing unattested about this suggestion. I'm not proposing anything that's never been seen in the manuscripts before. Everything involved in that change from Gherkin to Kirken is supported by attested corruptions in the medieval manuscripts. So, given the fact that this name, Kirken, doesn't seem to be attested anywhere else, I would argue that that indicates that it's not a genuine name, but it's a corruption of another name. And the other closest name, which it could very easily be a corruption of, given the attested corruptions, is Gherkin, the exact name of the maternal grandfather of Athrwys. Now, given my argument that the name Kirken is a corruption of the name Gurgen, that would mean that we have two people with the same name at the same time in the same place. So I think it's a very reasonable argument to propose that the Kirken who appears as the father of Dewey didn't just have the same name as Gurgen, but he actually was Gurgen, the grandfather of Athrwys. So with that being the case, that would mean that Dewey, or David, the famous one, was in fact the uncle of Athrwys, quite simply. No confusion necessary there, just Dewey was the son of Gurgen, hence the uncle of Athrwys, exactly like how David is said to be the uncle of Arthur in the Arthurian legends. At the very worst, the worst case scenario for this theory is that there was a famous Dewey, or David, in the sphere of activity of Athrwys, whose father had a very similar name to the name of the grandfather of Athrwys, easily leading to the mistake that he was his uncle. That's the worst case scenario for this theory. But I believe that the evidence does support the conclusion that this Dewey was the actual famous Saint David, and that he really was the son of Gergan, the grandfather of Athrwys, hence he really was the uncle of Athrwys. So that's my proposal, that's my theory. Let me know what you think in the comments below.